Good afternoon, Black Living Room Talk. I hope all is well with you all, and everyone who's listening. I hope everything is well with you, and I hope that when you get a chance, that outside of your busy lifestyle, that when you do stop by, I hope that you're enjoying listening to the readings. This is more of an educational reading first and foremost before anything. I mean, there's all kinds of reading material that I will be doing, but I kind of wanted to focus on this first. And it's one of those books, like I said before, that is not very attractive, and you really don't know what's inside of it until you start reading a little bit of it. And it's really deep. And sometimes some people may not be able to listen to it, let alone read it. But it's very, very knowledgeable and informative. So now yesterday I read the millenarian cults, about the millenarian cults. Now I'm reading about the new countries. You're going to hear some sounds. I hope you don't mind. It is springtime and we're having warm weather, and I like sitting out. So sometimes you might hear sounds or a little bit of music, but just different things like the birds chirping. I know you hear. But anyway, the new countries. The protest cult is an extreme choice of action. It is perhaps seldom adopted unless there are economic pressures that reinforce the emotional situation. It is not, of course, a choice confined to human populations of any particular skin color. Nazism, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Afrikaner Broederbond have markedly cult-like features. Those more trained to analytical use of reason than most black Muslims usually reject attachment to a cult as intellectually unsatisfying. Deeply concerned with their search for an identity, they often experience, however, the same emotional forces as the Muslims. The black Muslims are the symptom of a tension that spreads far beyond their membership, far beyond America. So it went back to talk about the black Muslims a little bit. Many Negro American writers alternate between an angry rejection of what has rejected them and an unhappy return to an Americanism that is all they have. It would be interesting to compare in detail these American writers with the French writers on negritude. It will have to be enough to say that the concept of negritude begins as a negation. It is inevitable to refer at this point to Aimé Césaire's famous poem. So Negro writers, he's saying, alternate between an angry rejection of what has rejected them and an unhappy return to an Americanism that is all they have. Of course. The poem goes on to proclaim something deeply felt but not intellectually definable, and then to state something positively African rather than black. Negro intellectuals share the emotional response of the masses to past white superiority and the associations that have linked color to colonialism, slavery, and poverty. Their emotional response is identical, their intellectual dilemma more agonizing. While the intellectuals will not give formal assent to the dogmas of a cult, they may be expected occasionally to react emotionally as though they were members of a cult. This applies not only to the spokesman for the national minorities, but also to the leaders of recently independent nations who are equally in search of a lost identity. The point is, borne out in the thought of contemporary African leaders in, for instance, Julius Nyerere's description of African socialism. Unlike European socialism, African socialism is not based on the overthrow of capitalism by means of class war. It rejects this negative approach and is based rather on familyhood. There is an ancient tribal unity of the extended kinship system within which every kinsman must be helped. Everyone has his work to do. There are no parasites and no exploiters. A tribal Garden of Eden. The only modification needed is the extension of the concept of kinship to include everyone in the nation and, eventually, all mankind. This, perhaps, utopian vision is further illuminated by D.K. Chiziz's well-known paper on the African outlook. He writes, "We of Africa belong neither to the East nor to the West. We excel neither in mysticism nor in science and technology, but in the field of human relations. That is where we can set an example to the rest of the world." He goes on to describe the African as intolerant of other people's ideas, hospitable, and deeply committed to family and personal relations. With us, life has meant the happiness rather than the pursuit of beauty or truth. We pursue happiness by rejecting isolationism, individualism, negative emotions and tensions on the one hand, and by laying emphasis on a communal way of life, by encouraging positive emotions and habitual relaxations. And he adds later, God knows we are not kind because we are fools, but because he ordained that we should be kindness drunk rather than pride drunk. It is easy to say that this is highly idealized and that all Africans do not always behave exactly like this. Shaka, for instance, behaved much more like the African stereotype of a European. But the criticism is not valid. No group lives up to its own ideals. If Christians had really been Christian, there would be no black Muslims. Importantly, Africans are here rejecting emphatically anything borrowed and constructing ideals of conduct that are altogether theirs. These ideals must not be Western, but recognizably linked with an ideal vision of the closed tribal system in which Africans once lived. Moreover, the system must be new as well as African. Through cooperatives, a clan can translate the old tribal structure into the modern money economy, writes Tom Mboya in Freedom and After. 100 such sentences could be found. The need for an African philosophy and African system of values is felt universally. Not surprisingly, the African personality, African socialism, and Pan-Africanism operate in some of the new African states as the dogmas of a creed. This becomes almost a cult, and all those who play a part in public life must give emotional assent to it. Frantz Fanon expresses this mood. The unconditional affirmation of African culture has succeeded the unconditional affirmation of European culture. On the whole, the poets of Negroism oppose the idea of an old Europe to a young Africa, tiresome reasoning to lyricism, oppressive logic to high-stepping nature, and on one side, stiffness, ceremony, etiquette, and skepticism. While on the other frankness, liveliness, liberty, and, why not, luxuriance, but also irresponsibility. African nationalism under colonial rule was forced to begin as rejection. To be successful in establishing independence from colonial rule, it had not, almost always, to recognize and make use of emotions similar to those of a protest cult. There were usually features reminiscent of the Black Muslims, the Nazis, the Afrikaner Broederbond, but much dependent on how acute was the need for unity and how intransigent the situation. In the 1950s, for instance, there was much less need for sacrificial commitment to an almost desperate cause in Tanganyika than in Kenya. There was no call for more in Dar es Salaam. But there was always some sense of struggle, of need for commitment, some feeling that everything must be put aside till freedom was won. This sense of commitment is always highly intolerant. It could hardly be expected that it would vanish overnight with independence. The old war against poverty and ignorance remained. There was the new need to make a nation from a group of tribes. All these factors were reinforced by the intellectual's dilemma, the search for an intellectual and emotional pedigree. This explains why cult-like features may well persist long after independence. Indeed, long after the need for them may seem, from the outside, to have largely disappeared. The emotional background in the ex-colonial countries of Asia is very different, but not quite so dissimilar as it seems at first sight. Cultures with written languages were ancient in Asia long before Europeans came on the scene, but at the time of the first contacts, these cultures were uniformly quiescent and in some cases decadent. The Europeans quickly established an ascendancy. Further, they made the same arrogant assumption in Asia as they had made in Africa and America, that the improvement of the native meant becoming more European. In India, during the early stage of contact with Europe, certain noble and progressive Indian minds, such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, sought to borrow all they could from the new culture. This stage was followed by one of revulsion, and all that could be connected with the Vedas was glorified. The true traditions indeed overlapped and continued side by side. There were representatives of both in the Congress Party until and after independence in 1947. Hindu orthodoxy, in a pure and intolerant form, was then and has remained a minority politically. The majority party still contains, however, the modernizing, borrowing element, and also another element whose followers still look and thought, if not in dress or manners, to the ancient scriptures. The best known of these scriptures is a debate staged on the battlefield in the presence of the enemy as to the advisability of fighting, indeed of any action at all. The debate ends with the conclusion. The word is actually inappropriate. There can be no conclusion to such thought, that man should perform his function. This carries to a Western mind an inescapable implication that the function is allotted. Nothing could differ more from the spirit of Ajax and Hector, pure extroverts. They do not agree. They do not argue about whether they should fight. Each boasts that he will win. The spirit of the Gita is not wholly removed from another Western influence, exemplified in the epistles attributed to John. But the substructure of Indian traditional thought is immensely foreign even to this strand of Western culture. Deeply ingrained is a readiness to look at every action sub specie eritinitis. The Gita seems to a foreigner to have more bearing on the conduct of government and business in India than the imitation of Christ has in Europe. India then faces, in perhaps the most acute form of all the Asian countries, not only immense problems of food, poverty, and population, but a double spiritual crisis. Traditional religious ideals are estranged from current business and politics. At the same time, India must find a way of fusing two cultures and creating a new identity of its own. The resentment of Asia, Africa, and to some extent Latin America at past behavior and at all assumptions of superiority is an actuality. How far is this resentment likely to lead to a rejection of Western values? It would be a mistake to think of Western values only in terms of things wanted. Most of the world does unquestionably want a number of things that originated in the West, though now often easily obtainable from Japan, such as bicycles and sewing machines and transistor radios back at that time. Now you can just know that that includes all the apparatuses that we have now, the cell phones, the laptop, computers, tablets, so on and so forth. No one is going to refuse a camera because he resents colonialism. But are Western ideals likely to be rejected because of colonialism and the association of color with slavery and oppression? In a passage already quoted, Gunnar Myrdal identifies certain American ideals, namely getting ahead in the world, individualism, the importance of education and wealth. Of these, individualism is widely rejected, often consciously by Africans, more hesitatingly by Asians. Education, all seek with eagerness and mixed expectations. On the importance of wealth, there is in all cultures a gap between expressed ideal and practices. All seek wealth while proverbially and ideally despising it. Not all give it equal emphasis. The new nations do tend to reject still other ideals, largely because of the West's own failure to live up to them. They recognize as yet no common intellectual authority with whom appeal can be lodged. Christianity, many of them have never accepted. Its association with the West has made it suspect to all. Lip service is paid to democracy, but this term is very diversely interpreted. There is little allegiance to the creeds of Locke, the encyclopedist, and the American founding fathers. Freedom of speech, liberty to express unpopular views, freedom of the press, and the judiciary, all these fight a losing battle. The world has known systems: Rome, Islam, medieval Christendom, within which a single ethical code prevailed. The world of today, with its immensely swifter physical communications and its interlocking trade and currencies, has no common cultural or religious code, only the feeblest beginnings of an international legal system, only the vaguest foundations for an international code of morality. Only the vaguest foundations for an international code of morality. This may due partly to modern Western man's vivid sense of failure, which has largely replaced the sense of sin. It is popularly expressed as a failure of the system of morality under which he was brought up, a failure of the Church, of Christianity, of democracy. It is, of course, really his own failure to bring closer the ideal systems of his religion and the practical assumptions by which governments and businesses function. However expressed, the consciousness of failure is real. How can the remnants of Western Christendom, the white nations, expect anyone else to be enthusiastic about ideals they themselves have so lamentably neglected? Wow. I've seen that in comments on Facebook. It is, of course, really his own failure to bring closer the ideal systems of his religion and the practical assumptions by which governments and businesses function. However expressed, the consciousness of failure is real. How can the remnants of Western Christendom, the white nations, expect anyone else to be enthusiastic about ideals they themselves have so lamentably neglected? These ideals do basically form one system. Although the English Revolution of 1688, the thought of the American founding fathers and the Enlightenment were a conscious protest against medieval Christendom. They grew from it. They were the child of the Christian system of faith that in so many ways they challenged it. It would be disastrous if this whole rich evolutionary development of thought were rejected because of the aberration of racism. Is this an imaginary danger? Franz Fanon writes. So he's answering the question. But every time Western values are mentioned, they produce in the native a sort of stiffening or muscular lockjaw. During the period of decolonization, the native's reason is appealed to. He is offered definite values. He is told too frequently that decolonization need not mean regression, and that he must put his trust in qualities which are well tried, solid, and highly esteemed. But it so happens that when the native hears a speech about Western culture, he pulls out his knife, or at least he makes sure it is within reach. The violence with which the supremacy of white values is affirmed, and the aggressiveness which has permeated the victory of these values over the ways of life and of thought of the native, meaning that in revenge the native laughs in mockery when Western values are mentioned in front of him. In the colonial context, the settler only ends his work of breaking in the native when the latter admits loudly and intelligibly the supremacy of the white man's values. In the period of decolonization, the colonized masses mock at these very values, insult them, and vomit them up. But it may be argued Fanon was an extremist, writing after frightful experiences in Algeria. Some of the British may console themselves with the paternalistic thought, our Africans don't feel like this. White Americans are comforted to think that the Negro still wants in. But the evidence suggests that there are times when every non-white person feels as Fanon's native feels. International affairs seem likely to be influenced for many years by such emotions. Because the West has failed to live up to the ideals of Christianity and democracy, of freedom and tolerance, a sharp tendency to reject them has arisen. But it may still be hoped that national minorities, particularly the Negroes, will accept a national code. This seems to depend not only on the working out of internal problems, automation and unemployment, poverty and housing, as much as human rights, but also on international race relations. International race relations. The rejection of Western values has frequently taken on various aspects of cultism. Cultism is not basically a racial reaction. People of a subordinate group are likely to behave in this way when faced with a situation that seems hopeless. But where the dominant group is a different color, there is an added permanence to the situation, a hopelessness that makes the occurrence of cultism more likely. The racial features of cultism are of the West making. They have appeared in the black Muslims because the Negro was rejected. They appear for the same reason in the new nation states. If there is no easing of world racial tensions, internal tensions will be more difficult to solve and cult-like behavior more likely to recur. The loyalty of national minorities in the United States and Britain may, in that case, be drawn on racial lines rather than national. The nightmare presented by the phrase "a lineup of rich white nations against poor non-white nations" would be succeeded by something worse: a lineup of white persons against non-white. Perhaps this is too crude and too gloomy a picture. In a recent essay, James Q. Wilson has pointed out that the Negro in politics can be effective with allies, but hardly in separate parties. Yet, he adds, the white liberal, in the eyes of Negro radicals, makes the fatal error of believing that meaningful change can be accomplished within the present political, social, and economic system. Most human beings are deeply ambivalent. Perhaps political behavior based on alliances within the present system is to be expected. Even though there are increasing signs of wanting out in literature and thought and emotion, it would be unwise to ignore that almost invariable pattern of subordinate groups and other situations who at first wanted in, but whose loving turned to hating before the superordinate were ready to receive them, before the superiorditate were ready to deceive them. Perhaps in the international sphere, too, the nightmare is cruder than it need be, yet it is alarming. The defeat of communism or the prevention of its spread is an objective of American and, to a lesser extent, British foreign policy. What is the assumption behind this, although seldom formulated? It surely assumes that in the area thus saved, there will be common standards of accepted international behavior, that, broadly speaking, the governments this side of the Iron Curtain will behave more and more like those of Scandinavia and Canada. The trends observable by the student of race relations suggest that this is improbable. Associations with color and racism smear the positive aspects of Western ideals. There is wide agreement on certain objectives. Many governments have signed the Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaims a variety of liberties seldom enjoyed in the past, seldom enjoyed today. But even if governments pay them more lip service, a chilled negative note about these liberties will still remain. They are the product of the Enlightenment and lead at best to the theoretical equality of laissez-faire liberalism. Such equality is not enough. Neglect and exploitation have to be succeeded not by equality but by benevolent discrimination. Until there is world government, this is unlikely to be forthcoming in a form and to be a sufficient extent capable of modifying in the resentments here described. This is a depressing, if realistic, note to sound. It may well be that it hopelessly underestimates the vigor and optimism of the American people, their ability to manage their own affairs successfully and to give leadership to the world. Talcott Parsons has written, just as successful Negro inclusion will put the seal on the Marxian era in diagnosing American society, so the United States, with strong Negro participation, indeed leadership, has the opportunity to present a true alternative to the communist pattern on a worldwide basis, one which is not bound to the stereotype of capitalism. He is entirely right in linking the problems and stating the challenge. If the challenge is not successfully accepted, the dangers will be many. I want to read some references off. I understand that in Swahili the word kalabar, has come to mean any act of injustice or oppression. In the 20th century, assimilation ceased to be the official aim. To one who is not French, however, the new ideal does not seem very different. It does not really affect my argument if the black Muslims have, in fact, passed their zenith, if the emotion they express is as important as I suspect Elijah will find in Elisha. I'm reading his references, some of them. And that is it for those references. There are like 25 of them, like Gunnar Myrdal and American Dilemma, New York, 1944, page 350. But that's in the book. But I just wanted to read off a few sentences that he used in this article of his. This was the complete reading of The Revolt Against Western Values by Philip Mason, The New Countries. The next readings will be about group identity and political change, the role of color and physical characteristics by Harold R. Isaacs. I hope that you will join me at that time. I'm going to wish you peace, love, and light. And I will be having some news coming up soon about how I'm going to start having a schedule for these readings, because life can take a hold of you, and I'm not talking about it negatively, but we all have our lives and we get busy, and I've had some people ask me when I was going to start back reading the book, and both of them. But I just, some things have been going on that have caused me to give attention to it, that I had, they had to take first on my list. But I'm back to what I love, but I have to have a schedule for it. And I appreciate you for listening, and I hope you have that wonderful weekend. Peace, love, and light. Hotel, Team Wahid.